Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with the program. My name is James Felton, Vice President for the Division of Inclusive Excellence, and I'd like to welcome everyone to part one of a two-part series on the N-word. Today's program will explore the history, etymology, and usage of the N-word by delving into topics of pop culture, whiteness, the power of words, and our communal responsibilities to each other. We want to inform you that today's session is being recorded. Additionally, feel free to post questions in the chat, either privately to the inclusion account or publicly for our speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. We'll have about 10 minutes or so left for questions. Finally, as we are joined in community today, we ask that you exercise civility and respect for the presenter and the other members of the audience. In accordance with college policy, acts of bigotry, bias, and hate will not be tolerated. It is my extreme privilege and honor to introduce today's speaker, Mr. RahK Lash. Dedicated to a life of social change, RahK Lash is a scholar-practitioner with a desire to motivate individuals through stories of failure and hope. As a director of the Center for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Social Change, the acronym IDEAS, and the Martin Luther King Scholarship Program at Ithaca College, he supports the development of students on their paths to becoming informed global citizens. With a Bachelor of Science degree from Western Carolina University, a master's from Arkansas Tech University, he is a student of life that embraces everyday challenges for growth. Mr. Lash is a former trainer with A Call to Men, an active brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, Black creative in poetry, art, and music, a superhero Blerd, which stands for a Black nerd, and a self-proclaimed comedian and dogdad to a Pitbull named Archer. Born and raised in Greensboro, North Carolina, as the son of a preacher, father, and hip-hop head mother, RahK has always used imagination and creative arts to navigate life and make meaning of it. As a first-generation low-income student, he attended Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, North Carolina, majoring in political science with a leadership minor. It was there that he would develop a love for community service, social justice, and leadership development through his involvement across the institution. Observing and supported by the demonstrated values of student affairs professionals, his path into higher education was made clear during his junior year of college. Before heading to Arkansas to complete his master's in college student personnel, RahK had a reckoning with his own identity after confronting internalized notions of white supremacy. After listening to Erykah Badu's On and On over and over, he began to research her background in philosophy. Learning Ka was Egyptian for inner self, there was rebirth of his mind, heart, and soul, nurtured by empowerment. Having the nickname of RahK since birth, only used by close family members, Rakim began going by RahK as a radical act of self-care and self-love. RahK enjoys pop culture from music, movies, and top 10 lists on YouTube. He plays the drums, studies and teaches US civil rights, the history movement, and is an aspiring writer in a similar vein of Donald Glover. Please give a warm virtual TC&J welcome to RahK Lash.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where home may be for you. The College of New Jersey, TC&J, it is an honor to be here with you. Once again, my name is RahK Lash. My pronouns are he, him. Thank you so much, Vice President James A. Felton III. What James didn't mention in that bio is that I was actually alluding to him as one of the professionals that inspired me. I got to meet James when I was an undergrad. So you all are blessed, honored, and fortunate to have such an individual and the Chief Diversity Officer of the Year at your institution. So I'm going to invite everyone to first just take a deep breath and inhale and exhale. It has been quite a season. Last week was quite a year packed into 7 days. And I know that a lot of us are still exhaling. All right. And so as my students at Ithaca College continue to remind me and my staff and my team, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to breathe. It's okay to stretch. So I'm going to invite you to take care of yourself because we're going to have a conversation, right? Today is step one in the process. I hope that you'll join us next week, but we're going to have a conversation and we're going to talk about it. right? We're not going to talk around it. We're going to name it. We're going to name what it is, and we're going to dive into it. If we're having a conversation around it, then we're not talking about what it is. So I'm going to invite you to take care of yourself during this time. My students, faculty, staff, I know that the Zoom remote engagement can be wearing a little heavy right now as we gear up for the end of the semester. If you need to, take a break, you need to close your eyes from looking at the screen. I have the slides here. We can make these things available, especially the resources. Have additional resource coming at the end that we can make available for the community. So don't feel the need to, look at the screen. We need to give our eyes a break. And I'm also going to invite you to be aware of yourself during this conversation. Now, there's a difference between being triggered and being uncomfortable. All right. Now, sometimes we use those words interchangeably. Now, the content, the subject matter, we're talking about the N word, which means that inherently we're going to have a conversation about race. We're going to have a conversation about racism and all the other isms over these next two engagements that we have with each other. For some folks, this may be triggering, right? This may induce an emotional out-of-body response where you are not able to control your spiritual, physical, mental response to this. And I encourage you to take care of yourself if that's true for you. All right, whatever that may look like. If you need to leave this space, this is being recorded, just so you know. So if you want to leave this space and come back to it, I encourage you to do that. If you're uncomfortable, I encourage you to stick around. All right, and we'll dive a little more deeply into what that means. All right, so for our time together today, I want you first to look at the steps, all right? Hopefully everyone can see my screen. If you're not looking at the screen, there's an image of the steps. Imagine a tower of steps, all right? What I often love to tell my students at Ithaca College, my faculty, my staff, is that when you come to a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, inclusive excellence, anything around identity work, anything about studying movements, I want you to consider it as one workout in the gym, all right? Or one session in class. Now, you don't go to class the first day of classes when the semester starts and get everything that you need from that one class and look at your professors like, I'll see you exam time, right? That's not how it works. You have to continue going back. When you go to the gym that first time, you don't get everything that you need in that one workout. You have to continue going back. And particularly around the gym or any type of activity, whether it's learning, whether it's engaging with something new, you're putting yourself under tremendous amounts of stress, right? Even learning how to play an instrument or learning how to play that new video game. Or I'm excited about the PS5. If you know where I can get one pre-order, please email me. I will drop my email. I'm struggling. But you're putting your mind back under the stress of learning. If you're physically doing something, you're subjecting yourself to this tremendous amount of stress. But the end goal is that you will learn and you will grow and you'll be able to do something or be something that you weren't before. So that's the same attitude that I encourage people to approach these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion or any aspect of identity. It's not always going to feel comfortable, but think about what the end result is. So we're going to talk about the history of the N-word. And to give you full disclosure, there are going to be points in this presentation where I say the N-word or the derivatives of the words or its various incarnations, okay? So I'm going to say the word for the purpose of this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about corruption of language as we transition from learning just about the history and the root of the word and thinking about its application. We're going to talk a little bit about the 20th and 21st century and the pop culture influences. We're going to hold some time for Q&A. Please feel free to use the question feature in the Zoom. If there's a question that you're not necessarily comfortable putting into the Zoom for whatever reason, that's totally fine. Please feel free to email Vice President Felton or anyone on that team. Jays, could you drop that email one more time where students, faculty, and staff could submit a question a little more anonymously or confidentially?
Yeah, it's in the chat under Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. And then we're going to wrap up. All right. Now, we have a very limited time today. Okay. Once again, this is one workout. We can't get it all today. All right. So there's so many things. If you are, a deep scholar, in studying movements and studying words and studying language, and you're like, what about this? What about that? Yes, all of those things are important, but we're not necessarily going to be able to touch on every single thing. There are 16-week courses taught about the N word, about race, about racism, about culture, that barely scratch the surface. So we're going to take our time. Hopefully, either we're going to be planting some seeds. Hopefully, this is the water that may, help flourish the seeds that have already been planted for you. Maybe this is the sunshine, or maybe this is the fertilizer you didn't really want to step in, but now you're in it. All right. So, question I'm going to propose to you first, and you don't have to drop this in the chat or anything like that. I just want you to think through this now and even after you leave this. Can you recall the first time that you were introduced to the N word and the surrounding conditions? And when I say the surrounding conditions, at what point in time, right, was that? How old were you? Where were you? Was it said as a term of endearment, or was it said to tear you down? Were you the one saying it, right? I want you to think back as far as you can. And so for me, just to give you a little humanized experience, threefold, I remember the first time that I heard the word was through music. So my first name is RahK. And if you, like me, love hip hop, the name RahK should be somewhat familiar to you, right? Some of your favorite artists today, no matter what genre, have been influenced by RahK. That's one of the pioneers of hip hop in the mid 80s, going through the 90s. And so where I grew up, my parents, we didn't have bookshelves, right? I didn't grow up with books. And I'm looking particularly at James's screens for that imagery of those beautiful books. I love books now, but we didn't have books in my house growing up. We had stacks of CDs and cassette tapes, right? So music was one of my first loves. And I remember listening, I believe it was, maybe it was Two Live Crew and some Uncle Luke. And for so many different reasons, I just remember my mom like pressing it and like taking it away. And I remember trying to, eventually learning the song and like saying the word nigga. And my mom kind of looking at me like I didn't get in trouble, but it was like, you don't need to be saying that. So it began to, this mystery and this cloud around this word of what is this? No education on why, what the word was. It was just like, you too young to be saying that. Second piece, there's a picture of me playing football. This is my second year playing football. You can't fully see me. I'm a big guy, all right? My father played football. I started playing football. And I remember like maybe the next game right after this picture, I played center and nose guard. I got my first sacked the quarterback. And we won that game. And I remember my father coached me that year. And I remember running back, the outside, and my father talking to the other coaches. And he was like, yo, that nigga big. And I was like, it was a little uncomfortable. I was like, my father just called me a nigga to his friends. And it was like, oof, I ain't like that. It's like, I was weird. Like he wasn't even talking to me, but talking about me and referring to me as a nigga to his other friends. And so that was a little awkward. And then the third piece, and particularly in my relationship with the N word, was being in Western North Carolina in the mountains. I was about 4.5 hours from home. And summer before my senior year, I stuck around in that area. I did not go home, got an apartment off campus. I just went to the gym, went to go wash my car, got to the gas station to put some gas in, and I'm bumping. All right. Now, I don't know about y'all, but for me, you can hear me coming down the street. All right. I love my music. My speakers hate me because I boom my bass. And so pull up to the gas station. I don't even know what song was playing that year, but it was a bop and I was bopping to it. And so I get out the car, like I see this truck that's illegally parked on the accessible ramp leading to the front entrance of the gas station. Nobody's supposed to park there. So this extended cab truck is parked there and it's backing up. There's so much space for this car to move. We're the only two people at the gas station. And so I see the car backing up, it slams on brakes, then it starts moving. And I see the driver's lips moving. And I'm thinking he bopping with me. I'm like, oh, he know this song too. That's what's up. Like, let's vibe out. And so I turn my car off. And then I finally hear what this person is saying. And this person is calling me everything in the book and a nigger, right? This white guy had a few friends in the car with him. And so I'm like, word? And so I began to approach that car. I don't know what was happening in that moment, one of those just visceral reactions. And then I saw a shotgun rack in the back of that truck. And I stopped. I like froze because like my entire life flashed before me in that moment. And he slammed on brakes, like, let's get it. And I was like, you know what? You have a good day. And that was one of the most scary experiences because there was no one else there. I didn't even see who was working inside the gas station. There was no one, anything could have happened at that moment. But I remember the intentionality, the aggression of rolling the word out of his mouth to intentionally steer hate and provoke a reaction out of me. So I want you to think about the first time that you can recall, you know, whether your relationship with the word, you heard it, you said it, and what were the surrounding conditions. So, inception of the word. Now, going back, different dialects, different terms, and we're going back centuries and centuries ago, right? The word, whether it's Nigar, Niger, Negre, Nigre, Niger, Niger, different derivatives from different countries, different communities, different dialects, different tongues, associated the word simply to be something that described darkness, all right? Something that described black. And the key emphasis that I want to put on that is this word was often associated to, you know, non-human objects, all right? Something to describe the sky, something to describe, you know, a concept, something to describe a feeling, not necessarily always applied and applicable to humans themselves, all right? But I do want you to place some emphasis on these operative words because they're going to come back later in this conversation over these next two sessions. Dark, dusky, gloomy, unlucky, bad, wicked, right? Night, all right? I want you to play those words. Just let those sit for a second. Let those sit. Those are the operative words that I want you to hold on to, all right? Now, if you are not looking at your screen, I do encourage you to take a look at your screen. The video that is playing right now, the number at the top is actually the year, all right? The point in time. Now you're gonna see these black dots go across the screen. And each one of those black dots represents a ship that is transporting enslaved humans from the continent of Africa, all right? So I'm just gonna let this play for a second. So that's called the 2-minute slave trade. It's at least available on PBS. It's a free resource. And so once again, you know, once we wrap these two engagements that we have, I'm going to release a, you know, 1-page document to have all of these things there. But if you want to Google that, look with that and sit that down and play that, you know, at half speed a little more just to dive into that. That's what we know to be the transatlantic slave trade. All right. Um, Actions and behaviors are preceded by thoughts and beliefs. I want you to sit with that. I want you to process that. I want you to think about that a little more. So, around this time at the beginning of the slave trade and even a little bit before, and actually I want to introduce us to some new language, and we often refer to slaves, we say, slaves, but I don't want us to lose the humanity of these individuals. So I say enslaved humans when I'm teaching my civil rights course or I'm doing presentations, or enslaved persons, because that person first language is important, and that's often left off of the narrative. And once again, words are important. But there's this beginning to be this universal thought of Black inferiority. All right. Other countries, other continents looking, other groups looking, particularly at Black folks during that time, and developing this universal attitude that Black was inferior, because of customs, because of culture, because of the way that folks chose to live their life, which isn't necessarily portrayed accurately when we look at things like television and movies and certain books. And so this attitude of inferiority, right, began to be internalized. And as this transatlantic slave trade is going down, there becomes this projection of that reality. So I tell folks all the time that words are a projection of reality, right? Now, how many of you have heard perception is reality, right? I'm a teacher at heart, so I was looking at the screen hoping folks would raise their hand. I just realized I'm in a webinar. I am so ready for this vaccine to drop so we can be back safely in person. I love being in spaces with people so that we can, feed off of each other's nonverbal communication. But if you've heard perception is reality, all right? Perception is shaped by culture, experience, and identity, all right? And so as words, when you put those things out, right, you're projecting your beliefs, your attitudes, and your thoughts. And if that Black inferiority complex that you are invested in tells you that these folks are dark, that these folks are dusky, these folks are evil, that they're soulless, and that they're not white, that is the reality that you are choosing to believe. And so I want us to think about Black, right? Think about just the concept of Black, right? Not even necessarily associated to Black folks, but up until recently, when you look at pop culture, when you look at movies, when you look at certain parts of history, right? This term, this color is associated with darkness, right? I was just watching, I don't know if there's any other 90s fans, but they just put out a new Craft movie. And I was thinking about how, Black is often associated with something creepy, with something, scary, something spooky. Now that, may be different for us today because all of us may have that one Black outfit, that's fresh, that we work so hard to try to keep clean, right? I got one of my freshest Black outfits and suits, but often we reserve Black as we associate it with certain things to be less than. And in thinking about that piece, I want you to ask yourself again, how much time and energy have you put into studying the transatlantic slave trade? Why or why not? All right. We are in hopefully post-election season, right? I'll say it's still post-election season a little bit, but there's some hope at the end of the tunnel. But looking at the memes, looking at the GIFs, looking at where we've been over the course of 2020, I believe that 2020 has exposed us to a world that we've always known we didn't want to necessarily live with and pass on to youth. But being at home and being remote, watching the murders and the injustice of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others, Tony McDade, and so many others, right? And watching this global civil rights movement, watching LGBTQ folks take a win in civil rights legislation, but then still being persecuted at the same time. 2020 has exposed us from home to a world that we don't want to live in. And so now that we've taken a first step towards changing the highest occupancy of leadership in this country, it's still up to us to actualize all of those things, right? The work doesn't stop. And so a lot of scholars say that if we don't study history, we're doomed to repeat it. So thinking about the N-word, thinking about the racism, the hate, thinking about Black Lives Matter, thinking about all of the rhetoric that we've seen over the past 4 years, how much time have you spent studying the transatlantic slave trade? Why, right? Everything that we live by and that exist today was influenced and informed, right? The foundations of this country, right? Major wars, economic booms, policies, all of these things have been informed by the transatlantic slave trade. So I want you to ask yourself and process, how much do I know about it? How much was I giving in my primary education, right? What questions do I still have, and what resources exist for me to take a deep dive? And why is that important for me to know that moving forward? If I truly want to be dedicated to this social justice work, if I truly want to play a part in social change, why is it important for me to know that history? So, as we step forward a little bit in time, the word nigger, from its earliest usages, was a term that carries contempt, rejection, and something that whites would particularly put onto blacks. I want you to look at the year in there, 1965. So I teach the civil rights movement, and I run an MLK Scholar program at Ithaca College. And as we open up and we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and then we move into 1865 and we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, what we see is what I call an evolution, right? In this hate finding a way to continue to exist, to uphold a racial hierarchy, all right? So we have slavery, which was abolished in 1865, but everybody didn't just wake up the next day and say, you know what, that's it, we're on board with this was wrong, let's move forward, right? Policy alone doesn't necessarily influence and affect change, but policy is important for any change to truly have the teeth necessary to bite and do what it's supposed to do. And so moving from 1865, we see another 100 years of what we call the Jim Crow era and the need for the civil rights movement, all right? And this word over here in the white section, Negro, this is one that when you watch movies, when you watch certain TV shows, it can throw you off a little bit. And so as we travel down to the South, we get to listen and we get to talk to folks on our civil rights tour that I take my first year students on, to see this kind of combination of well-intentioned folks that were taught not to necessarily say the ER word or nigger with the ER, but couldn't bring themselves to actually be respectful and say Negro. Now, what was happening at this time was post 1865, you begin to see the word Negro with a capital N, all right? And Booker T. Washington, if that's not a name that you're familiar with, I encourage you to write that down and look up who that individual was. But Booker T. Washington himself was being pressed about, you know, slavery is over. Should it be Negro? Should it be colored people? And so Booker T. himself said, you know what? We should be saying Negro, and actually placed an emphasis on having that capital. Black folks in this country specifically have always, before even thinking about this word in particular, N-word, you see these attempts at reclamation, at being able to have something for ourselves, and this attempt to try to define something rather than be defined by something that's set out for us by a racial hierarchy. So you begin to see this Negro with a capital, which was something that some folks said, this is what I want, this is what I want to be called by. So to give you that, right, to give you that respect, to give you that honor, to honor and make good on something that you want, that goes against everything that I've been taught that it means to be at the top of this racial hierarchy. So in Southern states, you see this Negro, right? Another derivative of that word specifically. So what I want to encourage everybody to think about and consider, and to actualize and to sit with, right, for a little while. When I say sit with it, I mean that, you know, after this presentation wraps up, still want you to think about that. Still want you to come to the table. Still want you to start that conversation with those around you. All of us on this chat have a racial identity, all right? Hopefully that's not the first time that you've heard that. If it is, it's okay. All of us have a racial identity, all right? White is a racial identity. Often when we come to the table to have a conversation about race and racism, you know, we talk about BIPOC or folks of color, right? But white is a racial identity, but it's often upheld as the default, right? And how the racial hierarchy has been put in place everything strategically gives whites the power to not be a part of the conversation, right? And so thinking about the N word specifically, thinking about the Jim Crow era, thinking about post-slavery, but as Dr. Carol McKinstry taught me, when you move against the status quo, be prepared for the status quo to move against you. And Dr. Carol McKinstry was a secretary working in the church of the 16th Street Baptist bombing when 4 little girls were killed in 1963, all right? And she told me that Jim Crow has basically turned into Dr. James Crow Esquire, all right? So if you think about catching a common cold when you were a kid, and thinking about catching a common cold when you were a teenager in your 20s, 30s, 40s, it's not the same strand of the cold that you caught when you were a child, but that cold finds a new way to attack your system. It finds a new way to exist. It gets a little more sophisticated. So Dr. Jim Crow basically just becomes Dr. James S. Crow, Dr. James Crow Esquire. And so upholding that racial hierarchy, we have this creation. Remember what we talked about earlier? Thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, all right? Those are the things that precede actions and this verbalization of words. Domination comes in the form of violence, brutality, right? Gaining prosperity and wealth, particularly in the United States, off the backs of Black folks. And then subjugation, all right? Using the word nigger to intentionally harm, to intentionally let folks know that there's a racial hierarchy in place, no matter what legislation exists, no matter what we can and can't do, no matter who's in office, right? I'm still going to try to subjugate you to keep you in line and uphold this racial hierarchy, all right? So there is no argument as to whether the word was racist, whether it was hurtful, or whether or not someone today that looks at somebody and says, you are a nigger, has a racial connotation behind it, all right? Because what we have to do when we talk about these things is paint the whole picture and have the entire conversation, all right? As I told you earlier, we can't have a conversation about the N-word without talking about racism. And we can't have a conversation about racism without talking about gender, without talking about class, and we're talking about all of the things that come together to tell an entire story. Pain, humor, and age. So today we're going to stay in the past a little bit. Next week is when we're going to move much more into today and the future. I'm looking forward to the panel. These are a panel of some of my close personal friends who are doing some amazing things in the world. I actually went to school with 3 of these individuals. So we're going to stay, in the past a little bit, but leading up to this conversation, I want you to think about yourself at maybe 15, 16 years old, all right? Or think about yourself at 12 years old. And if you were to pull a picture out of yourself at that age, would you be confident enough to share it with everyone in your personal network? Would you feel proud of that picture? I know me personally, I'd be a little embarrassed. What I've learned in life is that our values change over time, and that's okay. What I valued when I was 13 years old isn't necessarily what I value now. I was just having this conversation with folks. There was, I think Blavity was the one that put up, 2006. Everybody had Air Force Ones on, slouch socks, baggy jeans. I had the 6X long white tee. And that's okay. It's just not necessarily what I value now. And so when we have the conversation about the N-word and we transition to talking about the hard ER to the more relaxed, endearing A or we have to understand that everyone is not necessarily on the same page when we have this conversation. I sat on a panel a year ago, and I was the youngest person on this panel. And as we began to talk about, usage of the word and ownership, it was like a spectrum where me being the youngest and going kind of down the line to folks that were, a little deeper in age, it began to be a little more lax on my end, but a little more aggressive as to no, that's hurtful, right? That's not necessarily something that I value. As an individual walking through life with certain experiences, being able to visit other communities, or based on my lived experience, that's not necessarily something that I'm interested in talking about or interested in using, right? I sat on this panel with people that marched on the Selma Bridge for Bloody Sunday. I sat on a panel with people that fought in their local communities to get certain legislation passed. I sat with folks who took necessary steps in their community to fight gentrification and to fight for curriculum that was inclusive to certain individuals who suffered under being called nigger, who didn't necessarily want to have a conversation about whether it was okay to say nigger, right? And so age comes into this conversation, right? And remember what I told you, that perception is shaped by culture, experience, and identity, all right? And so coming to this conversation and thinking about age and how different individuals have experienced the word, we have to hold that at the center as we bring this conversation full circle and thinking about pain and thinking about humor. Now, hip hop is not a soundtrack to violence, all right? Often we think about objectification when we talk about gender norms, right? And when we think about this N word, hip hop is usually at the core of what folks love to blame, whether it's commentators, whether it's folks not necessarily connected to the culture of hip hop. But I want to encourage you that hip hop is not the soundtrack to violence, all right? There are so many other songs from so many different genres that do the exact same thing that hip hop does, even before hip hop was named. And I love to say before hip hop was named, because I think that hip hop, especially over the 20th century, it took a long time to form. It just didn't necessarily catch its beat until, late 70s going into the 80s. And so the images on the screen, if you're not familiar with who some of these folks are, we have Richard Pryor, we have LaWanda Page, we have Red Fox, all right? Now, I told you all earlier that I got in trouble a little bit when my mom caught me listening to that 2 Live Crew. The song was Dirty Nursery Rhymes. And so some of those earliest songs, I used to hear these voices, right? Same thing that happens today is somebody, a producer, will take a comedian, take a line from a movie and just put that track onto the CD, onto the track, and just loop it for the chorus. So I heard these voices and I got curious. I was like, who is that? And so as I began to explore and dig deeper, I found all of these old dirty comedians. And Richard Pryor and Red Fox particularly are, at least for me in my research and my study, can attribute them for taking the word nigga with that A and really kind of making it a little more mainstream, right? These Black comedians given a platform with wider ranges of audiences. Didn't necessarily ask for that at first, started very small. Comedy was very directed at particular, Black communities, but really began to help usher in and issue, this endearing kind of term. And so the history of nigga is really disputed, right? My own grandmother told me that, growing up, she was in South Carolina. She watched her mother and her grandmother, jokingly kind of say the word, but always kept it internal, right? And different books and different scholars will say different things around endearment and will make different arguments around can we truly actually, use that word for endearment. But as we think about pop culture and the influences and how that leads us up to where we are today, there's a few things that I want you to consider and a few things I need you to walk away with as we come into the next part of this conversation next week. There is no universal consensus amongst Black folks, all right, around whether it's okay to use the word nigga and, how that word is used and who should be able to use it. One of the biggest things that bothered me, particularly about the Trump administration, is, getting on the news and watching, the Black community as if, we're all one big group that has each other's numbers and, text each other every time something goes down. Individuals, right? There are individuals, there are sub-communities, there are subgroups that make up that larger population. But what I don't want you to do is to apply that same ideology to the people around you, right? When you're having this conversation, when you're starting this conversation, or if you're the type of individual where you find yourself in a situation where you said the word and now folks are holding you accountable to that. I don't want you to apply that ideology that, all Black folks use the word. And if they can use it in hip hop, I should be able to use it. That's not necessarily where we want to go with the conversation. All right. My politics on the word may differ than Vice President Felton's, right? His politics may differ than people within his network, right? So hold that true and deal with individuals on an individual level. Ownership and access, as we know, particularly in the United States, has traditionally been wrapped up in white supremacy. all right? So I had to deal with this on my campus, and a lot of us probably have, where we had a group of students go viral for saying the N-word a few years ago. And so we did a lot of, community meetings and town halls and work particularly in classrooms. And this conversation about ownership and access to the word kept coming up, and really boiling this conversation down to, well, if they can say it, why can't I say it? And the conversation that I tried to pivot and push us to was, why do you feel the need to say it? And particularly thinking about my white students, right? Having that brutal, honest conversation of, why do you feel the need to say it? Why do you feel ownership to that word? When we think about the history of this country, we think about who's been able to access what. We think about that racial hierarchy we talked about a little bit, and what that hierarchy gets you when you get to sit at the top. There's an ideology that's framed, consciously or unconsciously, about what I should be able to access and what I should be able to do as a result of giving this power that is afforded to me because I sit at the top of this hierarchy. And so once again, these are all the things that we have to think about when we come to this conversation and we think about the N-word. What else is at play around us, right? Not just who should get to say it, who shouldn't. Why is there a need for folks to want to say it, right? Why is there a need to access it just because someone else did? And Ta-Nehisi Coates, and once again, if there are names that I'm popping up and saying, especially my students, I encourage you to write that down and look that up. I tell students all the time, do you come to college to learn or to be taught, right? And it should be a healthy mix of both. I can sit here and give you the resources, but at the same time, I think that learning process happens when you take what's happening here and move forward with it and run the ball down to the end zone. So feel free to look up, some of the things that I'm saying that you may not necessarily be familiar with. Just make a quick list of things that you want to study as a result of this moving forward. And you do have resources on your college campus to help you with that. But there's a lesson to be learned from refrain, all right? Ta-Nehisi Coates said that to a student on a campus that said, well, why can't white people say the word? And what I'm not putting forth and what I'm not saying here, and what I didn't want this presentation to be about, was to give out passes to say, well, these people can say it, these people can't, right? Just wanted to bring us to the table to have this conversation and set us up for the next conversation that we're going to have with our panel, right? There's a lesson to be learned from refrain, right? So maybe if the conversation isn't necessarily about who has ownership of the word, can I or can I not say it, maybe we can open ourselves up to a different type of conversation. And I had a friend who went to college with, and this individual, white, but put himself in a lot of Black spaces, all right? And we had to have a lot of conversations undergrad about him using the word and saying the word. And one of his remarks to me was, I might be Blacker than you. You don't know where I'm from. I grew up around Black folks, and I grew up in this community. And so just recently, I believe it was, summertime, June, as we were seeing the global civil rights movement kick back off, I asked this person, how are you showing up? How are you showing up for Black Lives Matter? How are you showing up for the individuals around you? How are you showing up for your Black coworkers? How are you showing up? And this person had absolutely nothing to say. This person talked to me about colorblind racism. And this person, went down this rabbit hole of, a post-racial society based off of Obama. And so where that led me to think about and believe is there's this fetish and there's this need to consume Black culture, to see something and say, that's what I want. I want access to that. I want to be that, but not necessarily pick up the work of being connected, as Dr. King would say, in this single garment of destiny, and really caring about the experiences of Black folks. And so what I'm not saying is that Black folks should or should not be able to use the word. What I'm saying is this individual saw something, associated it with Blackness, wanted it, but then when it was time to actually show up and show out for the people and for the culture, that person was nowhere to be found. And those are dangerous things. And many of you may find yourself in similar situations with individuals that you're close to. But when we think about the world that we created, when we think about memes, and we think about GIFs or GIFs, however you choose to say it, we think about movies, we think about pornography. We think about all of the different things that shape and influence our culture, and we think about where that word is. And we think about how we normalize the word to be something either so simple for some and kind of erase and completely erase the sting that may come with that word to particular groups because everything around us has said that it's okay. We become, complicit in creating dangerous territories. All right. And one thing that I love to say at a call to men in my work and working with men is, I don't demonize pornography. That's not the conversation. It's not a conversation about morality. It's a conversation about influence. All right. It's a conversation about just like media, same as movies, same as music, what are we exposed to and what are we allowing to take place and take residency in our hearts and our minds and our souls. Right. And so I know that we are coming close to time. I know that Zoom fatigue is real. Students, I applaud you. Faculty, staff, I applaud you. It's a hard thing to come to Zoom after Zoom and listen to someone talk at you. So I'm going to stop right there because I put a lot out there. Vice President Felton, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, we have a couple of questions. Thank you so much, RahK. The first question is, hello, and thank you for hosting, RahK. This is great. I have maybe a stupid question, and maybe this isn't a good forum to ask, but why in today's day and age, do I still hear Black Americans referring to each other as N's? And what is your opinion on this?
Yeah. So no, not necessarily a stupid question at all. I think this is the right platform to ask it since we've opened the door. For me, it's less about what's behind that, right? I would ask what's behind the question, right? How are we looking at the word and saying, is it something that we feel people shouldn't do because I can't do it? For me, that's where the issue takes place, right? I don't necessarily care what individuals that have agency with each other choose to call each other. I have two older sisters, all right? And they refer to each other as the B word all the time, right? I'm not going there, right? I don't have agency, I don't have clout, I don't have capital, I don't have the relationship that they have. That's what they choose to refer to each other as. I don't think less of them for referring to each other as that. I know that when they call each other that it's not intentionally trying to demean each other, right? So I'm a part of an organization, a fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And there's this history with fraternities and sororities, particularly fraternities, with kind of these unofficial mascots. And so Alpha Phi Alpha, has this kind of unofficial relationship with an ape. And I remember I was talking at a campus for a call to men, thinking about masculinity and fraternity identity. And someone asked the question, why would you all get on the news and, do these monkey steps and monkey dances and different things like that, but then get mad when somebody calls you a monkey, right? And we think about what Roseanne Barr got canceled for saying on Twitter about one of our public government officials. And the response that I gave to that person is, whether I agree with it or not, when I get together with my fraternity brothers, I'm not trying to demean them by doing anything associated with that animal, right? When someone looks at me and calls me an effing monkey, right, you can feel the hate and the intention behind it. So I would encourage you to think about what's behind that. Where does that question come from, right? What's the question behind the question? And does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? And if that doesn't necessarily ask the question, we can continue to have the conversation. I'm willing to share my contact information and we can follow up. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you. Next question is, how can Black college students effectively address non-BIPOC when they use any variation of the N-word in regular conversation?
Absolutely. So the first piece that I love to tell students is don't feel like you're an educator by obligation. There are educators at your institution by occupation and obligation, all right? That can be trauma to take on, right? When you've been in class all day, maybe you're working multiple jobs, the things that you have to experience, particularly at a predominantly white institution, and just living and being in 2020. And then to come to a situation like that, where it's like, okay, do I say something? Do I not? I think existing in that space is one of the heaviest places to be in. So number one, I would say utilize the professionals that are in your network, Vice President Felton and the team of other folks that are there, I know that you have certain incident reports where if you don't want to take on that emotional labor in that time, fill out that incident report, right? And you can actually talk to someone before filling that out, because I know there's a whole host of things like, remaining anonymous and retaliation and what happens if, X, Y, and Z and folks find out. So that's one path, right? I never want students to feel like you are an educator by occupation. And I never want non BIPOC students to look at BIPOC students as educators, right? We wouldn't do that to anyone else. There are places and spaces for us to be educated. YouTube is a dynamic, free tool, right? YouTube is powerful, right? You can go out and search for certain resources where education has been put in place to help you and support you. So don't depend on the Black folks in your network to do that work. And I think particularly about Black folks having that conversation with their white counterparts or non-BIPOC counterparts. If you do choose to take that labor on, I want you to be aware of yourself first. I believe that there's a concept called earned animosity, right? I believe anger has its place in dialogue, especially if you have a reason to be angry. But not saying, manage your anger, but keep your eyes on the prize if you choose to engage in that work. To call people out and hold them accountable, but then call them in to whatever it is that you want them to do. And then hold them accountable to having that conversation with white folks. If I do work and advocate for gender equity, my agency and my true work happens when I'm alone with my fraternity brothers and nobody's there, because then it's an integrity play. Because a lot of the experiences of men, bonding is at the expense of women. So when there are no women present, that's when it's my opportunity, to step in and to truly put that work into play. And so hold your white counterparts accountable to doing that as well if you choose to step into that space. But also know that you can step out at any given moment, right? Even if you start the conversation of calling somebody out to call them in, if you want to stop, take care of yourself, stop, pull out, walk away. And once again, there are other resources that are there to support you and help you.
All right, here's a heavy one. My question is, when white faculty teach literature that includes the N-word, what is your opinion on them pronouncing it when reading it out loud? Should they censor the word when reading it? As a white person, I have always been taught to never say the word aloud, no matter what, to not traumatize anyone.
I just thought about, I don't know if y'all watched the Boondocks, but I just thought about the episode of the Boondocks where Riley's teacher got in trouble. If you haven't seen that, it's definitely give it a look. I love the Boondocks for the satire and the conversation pieces that it starts. It's a nuanced conversation. What I would say right now in this moment in 2020 and where we've been over the past century and even just the past week, me personally, RahK Lash, I would encourage you to say the N-word, right? Just where we are. I would encourage you to say the N-word, all right? If you know the history, if you know the trauma, if you know that, there is no one universal consensus, if you know that you run the risk of potentially causing more harm than you do good, then why walk down that road, all right? You have no way of knowing what the effect is going to be. And I know and I understand that, from certain educational stances, it's like, we have to say the word. Do you, right? Do you really have to go down that road? So I would say where we are in this moment of time, just say the N-word.
All right, last question here. When I defend me, a Black female, saying the N-word, but telling my white counterparts that they cannot, it's because Black people saying it is a reclamation of the word. When they say it, it means something else to me. Is that wrong? And what do you think about that?
That's a great question. I don't think it's right and wrong. I don't think it's wrong. Once again, I think perception is shaped by culture, experience, and identity. I know that even for me, just my nickname of RahK growing up was something that was internal, right? My sisters could call me RahK, my mom, my pops. But if you called me RahK at school, we got a problem. My name is Rakim. You don't know me like that, right? And so what shapes experience in that piece of culture, right? Cultural clout, cultural capital, cultural agency, right? If we have that cultural agency with each other, then that's between us. And that there's a set of agreements and a set of standards that we've come to, because all communication, isn't necessarily verbal, but within that cultural agency, that cultural validation, we have an understanding. It's okay if that doesn't necessarily translate. I had a student, as I run the MLK Scholar program, she actually opened my eyes up to a different experience just recently. And so, I let students follow me on Instagram. I think that's fine. We're humans outside of work. And so I saw on her Instagram that, she and some other MLK scholars were like using the N word, like the hard ER, jokingly. And so me and my little administration world, I'm like, oh my, y'all are MLK scholars, Martin Luther King scholars. And y'all are putting this on Instagram. And so the student actually worked for me at the time. So I pulled him into my office to have a conversation. And the student talked to me about, institutions being able to dictate what an individual does and doesn't do, right? And that really opened my eyes up, especially thinking about that racial hierarchy, and really allowed me to step back and not necessarily want to dictate what my students do. And that's not necessarily my job to do that, right? Whether I agree with what you're doing or not, you have that cultural agency and clout with each other, and that's what you choose to do on this set of standards and agreements. Okay, fine, that's up to you. But then as my provost kind of called me out on this same panel, while there is influence in leadership, folks watching that, seeing that, and taking their cues from you, whether you want it to be or not, I think that that's a heavy thing to place on one individual's shoulders to say, well, I'm going to do it because you did it. That's not necessarily the case. So I don't think it's wrong to feel that way personally. And once I can't give you, a silver bullet or a pass or a certificate to hang on the wall to say, it's okay for me to feel that. I can validate that human to human in the moment, because, I may feel the same way. And once again, don't necessarily feel like you have to take on the education of working with those folks that try to justify that.
Thank you so much, RahK, for your presentation and for answering those questions. If we could give Mr. Lash a virtual round of applause. Again, today's session is being recorded, and I believe Mr. Lash will provide us with some follow-up resources that we can share on the Inclusive Excellence Divisional website. As is on the screen there, the N-word Part 2 will take place next Tuesday, November 17th from 7 to 8 p.m. And it will consist of a panel of creative geniuses, educators, artists, and activists who again will tackle notions of ownership, belonging, and my favorite topic, the culture vulturism as it relates to the N-word. Thank you so much for attending today's session and enjoy the rest of your day.